The first thing I noticed wasn't the noise. It was the silence. And if you've spent enough years around timber country, you know exactly what I mean. Not the peaceful kind of silence you get before sunrise when the fog is hanging low over the hills and everything feels still. This was different. This was the kind of silence that makes the back of your neck tighten before your brain figures out why. Then I saw the stump. Fresh cut, bright wood exposed to the morning air. And about 50 yards beyond it sat a massive green logging machine, parked right where it had absolutely no business being. That's the moment I realized somebody had just made the most expensive mistake of their life. My name's Ryan Carter, and for most of my life I've owned 82 acres outside a little town called Pine Hollow, Kentucky. Not farmland, not hunting property, timberland, the kind of woods people drive past without thinking much about. Oak, hickory, maple, cedar. The kind of place that looks ordinary until you've spent enough years walking it to understand every bend in the creek and every tree standing on the ridges. My grandfather bought that land after coming home from Korea. Back then it wasn't worth much. Just rocky hills, thick woods, and a small creek cutting through the valley. But to him, it was everything. He spent decades taking care of it, planting trees, repairing trails, building fences by hand. Every Sunday afternoon, he'd walk the property line like it was some kind of sacred ritual. When I was a kid, I thought he was crazy. Now I'm almost 50, and I do the exact same thing. Funny how that works. About 6 weeks before everything happened, a logging company moved onto the parcel north of mine. Their name was Summit Ridge Forestry. Big operation, big equipment, lots of money. The kind of company that rolls into a small town with shiny trucks and acts like they've already bought the place. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Logging is part of life around here. Trees get harvested. Land changes hands. Nobody makes a fuss. But something about those guys rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was how fast they drove down county roads. Maybe it was the way they talked to locals. Or maybe it was their foreman, a guy named Cole Mercer. I met him at a gas station one morning while grabbing coffee. Big guy, broad shoulders, expensive sunglasses. The kind of smile that never actually reaches the eyes. He nearly backed a trailer into my truck and somehow looked annoyed at me afterward. He glanced down at my muddy boots and said, "You own land around here?" I laughed. "Depends who's asking." The cashier chuckled. Cole didn't. He just nodded toward the hills. "We're cutting North Ridge this month." I shrugged. As long as you stay on your side of the markers, you can cut down the moon for all I care. That got a little smirk out of him. Not a friendly one. The kind that sticks with you afterward. A week later, one of my boundary stakes disappeared. Not a huge deal by itself. Things happen. Machines bump into things. Storms knock stuff over. I replaced it and moved on. Then another marker vanished. Then another. And suddenly that little voice in my head started getting louder. I called the county survey office. Pulled old maps. Checked records. Everything matched perfectly. The boundaries weren't vague. They weren't disputed. They weren't even complicated. Steel survey pins had been in the ground for decades. Bright paint markings covered dozens of trees. Anyone crossing those lines knew exactly what they were doing, unless they wanted an excuse not to know. A few days later, my neighbor, Walter Briggs, stopped by while I was repairing a fence behind my barn. Walter was 72 years old, retired Marine, one of those men who somehow manages to stand perfectly straight no matter how old he gets. He watched me work for a minute before speaking. "You been up north lately?" I shook my head. "Nope." He scratched his beard. "Might want to." Then he walked away. That's all he said. Now, if anybody else had said that, I probably would have ignored it. But Walter wasn't a man who wasted words. The next morning, I grabbed a thermos of coffee and headed toward the North Ridge just after sunrise. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. Halfway up the trail, I caught the smell. Fresh cut wood. Sweet. Sharp. Wrong. I stopped walking. For a second, I couldn't figure out what felt off. Then I noticed sunlight. Sunlight shining through parts of the forest where sunlight should never have been. My stomach dropped. Because when you've walked the same woods for 40 years, your brain memorizes them. You know where shadows belong. You know where the trees stand. You know when something is missing. And something was very, very missing. I started moving faster. Then I found the first stump. Then another. Then 5 more. And by the time I reached the ridge line, I wasn't looking at a mistake anymore. I was looking at a disaster. Entire sections of forest had been erased. Huge oaks, old maples, young cedar growth, gone. And then I reached the walnut grove. The grove my grandfather planted with his own hands. The grove he used to bring me to every summer. The grove he'd spent decades protecting. I stopped walking. I couldn't even feel angry yet. I just stared. 7 trees. 7 massive black walnut trees. All gone. Only stumps remained. And as I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, I heard the sound of diesel engines somewhere uphill. Then chains rattling. Then machinery moving. Slowly. Deliberately. And when I looked through the trees, I saw one of Summit Ridge's skidders dragging a freshly cut walnut log up the hill. My walnut log, like it belonged to them. And that's when the anger finally arrived. Not hot anger. The cold kind. The dangerous kind. The kind that makes everything suddenly become very clear. I started walking toward their operation. And before that morning was over, I was going to have my first conversation with the men who thought they could steal from me and get away with it. By the time I reached their staging area, I wasn't seeing red. Honestly, I wish I had been. Haga burns fast. What I felt was colder than that. The kind of anger that settles into your bones and starts making calculations. The clearing sat about 200 yards beyond my property line. Trucks were lined up near a portable office trailer, while workers loaded logs onto flatbeds. Chains rattled. Diesel engines growled. Nobody looked particularly concerned. That part stuck with me. Nobody acted surprised. A young guy wearing a hard hat noticed me first. He couldn't have been older than 23. He glanced my way, then immediately looked toward the trailer. "Hey, Cole." The foreman turned around. Coffee in one hand, clipboard in the other. Same sunglasses. Same expression, like I was interrupting something important. I stopped about 10 feet away. "You crossed on my property. No greeting. No small talk. Just straight to it." Cole stared at me for a moment, then shrugged. "Boundary issue." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was such a stupid answer. "No," I said. "It isn't." He took a sip of coffee. "According to who?" "The county's survey." A couple workers suddenly became very interested in their equipment. One guy looked at the ground. Another started adjusting a chain that didn't need adjusting. Nobody wanted eye contact. That told me everything. Cole tilted his head. "Look, Ryan, property lines get confusing out here." I pointed back toward the woods. "You mean the orange markers every 50 yards? Machines knock things over." I nodded slowly. Funny how they only knocked over the markers leading onto my land. His jaw tightened just slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for me. Then he made a mistake. A small one. The kind arrogant people make when they think they're smarter than everyone else. The owner next door said the line wasn't accurate. There it was. The real reason. Not confusion. Permission. Or at least permission they wanted to hear. The neighboring parcel belonged to a man named Grant Holloway. And Grant and I had history. Not the friendly kind. A few years earlier, he'd tried buying 20 acres from me near the creek because it would have given him easier access to one of his future timber sales. I turned him down. Twice. After that, things got weird. Fence sections mysteriously cut. ATV tracks appearing where they shouldn't. Little annoyances. Nothing major. Just enough to let you know somebody was carrying a grudge. I looked back at Cole. "You got paperwork showing that boundary moved?" "Nope." "A survey?" "Nope." "Then why'd you cut?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. I pointed toward one of the trucks loaded with walnut logs. "Every piece of timber that came off my land gets documented starting today." One of the workers snorted. Cole smirked. "You threatening us?" I shook my head. "No." Then I smiled. "I'm promising paperwork." A couple guys laughed. I turned around and walked away. And that bothered them far more than if I'd started yelling. Because angry people are predictable. Calm people are dangerous. The second I got home, I called my cousin Ethan. Ethan owned a surveying company outside Lexington and happened to know more about timber law than most attorneys. When he answered, he said, "If this is about your truck again, I'm not driving 3 hours to tell you oil changes matter." I said, "How much trouble does a logging company get into for knowingly cutting mature walnut trees off somebody else's property?" Silence. Then another silence. Finally, he said, "How bad?" I told him. 7 black walnuts. Multiple hardwoods. Heavy equipment damage. Creek bank disturbance. The whole thing. By the time I finished, he let out a long whistle. "Well," he said, That's going to ruin somebody's week. The next morning, he showed up with survey equipment, drones, GPS units, old records, and enough technology to make NASA jealous. We spent 2 full days documenting everything. Every stump, every tire rut, every damaged tree, every inch of disturbed ground. The drone footage was especially brutal. From the air, you could see exactly what happened. The cut line didn't accidentally drift across the boundary. It bulldozed through it. Straight, clean, obvious. At one point, Ethan looked at the footage and shook his head. Buddy, what? They didn't cross your property line. He zoomed in. They invaded it. That was the first time I'd laughed in days. But the laughter disappeared once we started calculating damages. Most people don't understand what mature timber is worth. They hear tree and think firewood. That's not how it works, especially not black walnut. Furniture companies pay serious money for quality walnut. Cabinet makers love it. Woodworkers practically worship it. Some of those trees have been growing for 60 years. A couple were probably worth more than my first truck. The numbers climbed fast. 15,000, 30,000, 50,000. Then restoration costs got added. Creek stabilization, soil repair, replanting, environmental impact. The total kept growing. By sunset on the second day, we were looking at nearly $90,000 before penalties. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the report. Outside the window, I could see the edge of the damaged forest, or what used to be the edge. Ethan sipped coffee and finally said, "You know, Kentucky timber trespass laws don't play around." I nodded. I know. Triple damages if intent gets proven. I looked up. Triple. The word hung in the room. Suddenly, this wasn't a $90,000 mistake. This was a $250,000 disaster waiting to happen. And for the first time, I started wondering whether Summit Ridge understood how badly they'd screwed up. We built a full claims package. Professional surveys, drone imagery, property records, timber valuations, photographs, expert assessments, everything. By the time we finished, the binder looked less like a complaint and more like a homicide investigation. I sent copies to Summit Ridge's corporate office. Certified mail, digital copies, tracking numbers, the whole works. Then I waited. 3 days later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. The man on the other end was laughing before he even introduced himself. Ryan Carter? Who's asking? This is Michael Stanton with Summit Ridge Legal. More laughter. I just finished reading your invoice. My invoice. I leaned against a fence post. Great. Then you know where to send payment. That made him laugh even harder. Sir, you can't seriously expect us to pay $200,000 over a property line misunderstanding. There was again. Misunderstanding. Corporate language for getting caught. I said, your crew stole marked timber. Allegedly. I hated that word instantly. People use allegedly when the evidence is sitting in plain sight. I stared across the pasture. You hauled the evidence away on your own trucks. Silence. Just for a second. Then his voice changed. Litigation can take years, Mr. Carter. Expensive years. There was the threat. Not direct enough to repeat in court. Just enough to send a message. The problem was they misunderstood who they were talking to. I spent 25 years working construction. I've had grown men scream 6 inches from my face over concrete pours and delivery schedules. Intimidation stops working after a while. I said, Michael, you know what my favorite part of this whole situation is? What? You think I'm bluffing? Then I hung up. 3 nights later, somebody burned one of my property markers. And that's when the entire situation stopped being about money. Because standing there at sunrise, staring at a charred survey stake still smoking in the dirt, I realized something important. Someone wasn't worried about losing. They were worried about what happened if the truth came out. And as it turned out, the truth was a whole lot uglier than anyone had imagined. The sheriff's department sent Deputy Rachel Dunn out that same morning. Rachel had grown up 2 counties over and had exactly 0 patience for people who thought money made them untouchable. She crouched beside the burned survey marker, poked at the blackened wood with a pen, then stood up and looked toward the ridge where Summit Ridge's operation sat. Not exactly subtle, she said. No, you got cameras out here. Not on this trail. She nodded slowly. Anybody you'd like me to look at first? I laughed once. Well, unless raccoons learned how to carry gasoline, I got a couple ideas. I got a smile out of her. Then she got serious again. Off the record. Ryan, you're making some people nervous. I didn't need her to explain who. By then the story had spread through Pine Hollow. Small towns don't have social media. Small towns are social media. Everybody knew. Everybody talked. And the funny thing was people started treating me differently. Not because I'd threatened anyone. Because I stayed calm. That made people uncomfortable. A week later, Summit Ridge called again. This time nobody was laughing. Michael Stanton sounded exhausted. We'd like to arrange a formal settlement meeting. I looked out toward the woods. Found your checkbook already? No response. Just a sigh. Can we meet next Tuesday? And that's how I found myself sitting inside a law office conference room in Lexington. I brought Ethan. I also brought my attorney, Claire Whitmore. Now Claire was about 5'3", weighed maybe 100 pounds soaking wet, and scared grown men for a living. The first thing she told me before we entered the room was simple. Let them talk first. Why? Because guilty people hate silence. Turned out she was right. Inside sat Michael Stanton, 2 Summit Ridge executives, Cole Mercer, and another attorney wearing a watch that probably cost more than my pickup. Nobody looked happy, especially Cole. The swagger was mostly gone now, still sitting straight, still trying to look confident, but the cracks were showing. Michael cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, after reviewing the documentation, we acknowledge there may have been unintentional encroachment during harvesting operations. Claire immediately leaned forward. You mean trespass? The room got quiet. Michael forced a smile. Encroachment. Claire smiled back. Trespass. Nobody spoke. For a moment, it felt like watching 2 people politely fight with knives. Then Summit Ridge slid a settlement offer across the table. $95,000. A year earlier, that number would have sounded life-changing. Now it just felt insulting. Claire didn't even touch the folder. She simply asked, is this before or after statutory damages? One executive finally spoke. Gray hair, expensive suit, arms crossed. Let's not pretend your client is guaranteed anything. Claire opened our file. Calm, methodical, dangerous, marked boundaries. She turned a page. Survey records. Another page. Drone imagery. Another. Documented timber removal. Another. Burned survey marker after notice of claim. Then she looked directly at him. You're right. The executive smirked. For about half a second. Then Claire finished. This isn't guaranteed. She paused. It's catastrophic. The room went dead silent. Even Cole looked down. And right then I knew something. Their entire defense had collapsed. Nobody was arguing confusion anymore. Nobody was talking about boundary disputes. Because they all knew the truth. The only question left was how much it would cost them. About 20 minutes later, the meeting paused so Summit Ridge could discuss things privately. Corporate language for panic. I stepped outside onto the patio overlooking the parking lot. Ethan lit a cigarette. Looked at me. Grinned. You realize they're terrified, right? I shrugged. Good. He laughed. Ryan, they thought they were bullying some guy in muddy boots. He pointed toward the building. Instead, they walked into a forensic crime scene with chainsaws. For the first time in weeks, I laughed. A real laugh. The kind that sneaks up on you after carrying stress too long. A few minutes later, the door opened. Michael stepped outside alone. Notie. Top button undone. Different man entirely. He stood beside the railing for a while before speaking. Off the record. Depends. He stared out toward the parking lot, then finally said it. Cole pushed the crew south. I didn't respond. He knew the markers were there. Still nothing. Michael exhaled slowly. Grant Holloway told him nobody would fight it. There it was. The truth. Not confusion. Not a mistake. Not an accident. Greed. Arrogance. And the belief that ordinary people stay quiet. Most disasters are built from those 3 things. Michael rubbed his face. Corporate's worried. They should be. If this goes public. I finished the sentence. Every landowner around here starts checking boundaries. He nodded, because he knew I was right. What happens if we pay? He finally asked. I looked toward the hills beyond the city, toward the woods, toward land my grandfather once walked. Then I answered, you restore what you damaged. He waited. You stay off my property forever. Another pause. And maybe next time somebody sees a boundary marker, they stop the machine instead of pretending they didn't. For the first time, Michael actually smiled. A tired smile, but a real one. 2 weeks later, the settlement cleared. Not the maximum amount we could have won in court, but enough. Enough to hurt. Enough to matter. Enough to make sure nobody forgot. The restoration works started that spring. New saplings, creek repairs, soil stabilization. The forest will recover someday. Maybe, but some things don't come back on our schedule. 7 walnut trees took generations to become what they were. No check can replace that. A few months later, I walked through the restored section at sunset. The air smelled like fresh earth. Young trees swayed in the breeze. Birds had already started returning. I stopped beside one of the old walnut stumps, the same stump where this whole story had really begun. And for the first time in a long while, the woods didn't feel wounded. They felt like they were healing. Slowly, patiently, the way forests always do. But every now and then I still think about how close they came to getting away with it. If Walter hadn't warned me, if I hadn't checked the ridge, if those property lines hadn't been documented, nobody would have known. And honestly, that's the part that bothers me most. Because there are a lot of powerful people in this world who count on regular folks staying quiet. Sometimes they're after your land. Sometimes your money. Sometimes your dignity. The details change. The game stays the same. So now I want to hear from you. If you were sitting where I was, would you have taken that first settlement and moved on? Or would you have pushed all the way through court for every dollar possible? And here's the bigger question. When a company knowingly does something like this, deserves a second chance after making things right, or should one act of greed be enough to destroy them forever? Let me know down in the comments. Because I've heard both sides of that argument. And honestly, I can see why people feel so strongly about it.